But the challenge, the equity challenges are much bigger than just the financial system. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, what Justice Page was talking about, which is education, which is how do we make sure that those children of that family get the skills that they need so that they can end up getting a good job, be able to save money for themselves and for their children. I mean, education is one of those things that leads to generational change. You know, one child gets that good education, then his or her children have much better opportunities, and their children have much better opportunities. It's in my estimation, it's the most powerful force we have to change the trajectory of where families are, so that they're on a better footing, and their kids and their grandkids. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. My name is Jerica Anderson, and my question is for Justice Page. As we work together to reimagine what our education system can look like to authentically provide culturally relevant and youth-focused educational experiences, how do we best center youth voice in designing those new systems?
Well, how do we, and I would emphasize the one word, we, bring about real change? We get involved. Those of us who have the opportunity and the ability, we need to stand up and say, it is time for change. Those of us who have spent years sort of tinkering around the edges, it is time that we change the system, because this system has failed us. I said it before, I'll say it again. It has systemically and systematically failed us. We need to become the forefathers and foremothers of an education system for the future. You know, our current Constitution is from 1857. I need not remind anyone, although I will, that in 1857 slavery was rampant in large parts of this country. Indeed, the United States Supreme Court issued an opinion which, and I paraphrase, said essentially these words: those who had been imported into this country had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. That was the context for our current constitutional language. We have the power. Everyone here, everyone watching, we have the power to change the future. But we have to do that. We have to change the future. And it's going to take a lot of work. I talked about amending the Constitution to make education a civil right, but that's just the first step. Then we have to design a system that ensures that individual children get educated, and that every child, rural, urban, black, white, indigenous, doesn't matter, every child gets an education that will allow them to achieve their fullest potential.
Thank you. Thanks, Justice Page.
My name is Pat Welter, and my question is for Janice Sims. Janice, you're a local Promise neighborhood advocate for many areas, education and housing, income, etc. Aside from the education system, which you've already spoken about, can you just give us a little bit of an idea about how the economy and the housing systems are treating our African American families in this area?
Yeah, the economics and housing piece is a challenge, and our system is broken. What are we going to do about it? So I have some statistics here from the Greater State Equity Board, just published from Wilder's research. Although about 60% of our children in public schools are colored, only 17% of the teachers are, 8% of the administration are colored. In the greater St. Cloud area, 84% of white students graduate high school in 4 years, and only 60% of students of color graduate in 4 years. So to answer your question, education isn't the only system not serving people of color. First, our regional economic system is set up for the residents of color to fail in poverty rates that are 2 times to 5 times higher than the average poverty rate in the area. Second, in housing, 57% of black households are house cost burden, meaning that they pay 30% of their income for housing compared to less than half of the amount of 22 households of whites. So there's a big difference in that gap, and we need to close the gap so that the balance is equal. It's way off.
Thanks, Janice.
This question, hello, I'm Ann Kofel. And this question is for Neil Kashkari and relates to Janice's answer there. We all acknowledge that systems outside of the educational realm impact how children learn. As a legal aid lawyer, I see our partnership with Promise Neighborhood, where we help stop evictions, help restore driver's licenses, and ensure safety, as being part of a systemic approach to recognizing that a strong educational system requires strong families. In what ways can we as a state and community support similar partnerships across the many systems, criminal, financial, employment, public assistance, and others, impacting families?
Thank you for your question. I mean, I think Promise Neighborhoods are a great model that have been proven to be very effective in bringing all of the different support and services that families need, because all of these components that you talked about matter. They matter a lot. And so I think the Promise Neighborhoods, Jeffrey Canada from Harlem Children's Zone has been an advisor to our bank. He's spoken at some of our conferences where we could learn what they did there. Their Northside Achievement Zone in North Minneapolis is another example, just like the Promise Neighborhood here. So I think Promise Neighborhoods show great promise and are showing great results. But one thing I want to caution us, sometimes you'll meet people who will say, oh, it's not about education. You have to solve all of these things first in order to help kids learn. And that is an excuse to preserve the status quo. And so we have to not accept those answers. People will come up with all sorts of complicated reasons. Oh, it's not the schools, it's the families. You have to first solve poverty. Other states are doing a much better job than Minnesota in educating their children of color and their low-income kids. Those states have poverty too. Those states have families with challenges too, and yet somehow they're able to get much better outcomes for their kids. I refuse to accept that Minnesota is somehow inferior to Florida in our ability to serve our kids. We just have to stop making excuses and stop accepting excuses. You're not making excuses. Too many people are. We have to stop accepting excuses and hold one another accountable to actually delivering for all children in Minnesota.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you. I'm Lenora Hunt, and this question is for Kevin Lindsay. In our experience, there are too many cases when behaviors of black kids in schools here, especially black boys, brings consequences that are harmful and unfair. Too many times, instead of trying to see the needs of the kid and what is really causing the behavior, schools label black kids as learning disability and put them in special education classes, remove them from mainstream education, or they suspend or expel kids. This is not new, and sometimes schools get called on the carpet for doing this, but it keeps happening. What can parents in the community do to get to the bottom of this and turn things around?
Thanks for the question. Just to give folks in the audience a little background. So as Commissioner of Human Rights, we had an opportunity to take a look at data concerning suspensions from school districts. Each school district is required under Minnesota law to submit to the Minnesota Department of Education Commissioner anytime they suspend a kid for more than 1 full day. And then they have to identify the reason or rationale for why they suspended the kid, okay? So if I punch Neil and that's why I got suspended, it has a very high rating. If I talk to a teacher in a disrespectful way, it has a lower rating. okay? So the Department of Human Rights reviewed data for 5 years. And what we found within the data for over 5 years, and looking at it for every school district, that kids were most often, because they had interacted inappropriately with another adult within the building or another student in the building. Not because they had drugs, not because they fought, not because they had something illegal on them. Somewhere between 34 and 37% of all suspensions every year for more than a day in Minnesota is for disrespect. What's also interesting in that 5 years worth of data is somewhere between 4 and 5% of all suspensions every year are for attendance, not being there in school. Let me say that again. 4 to 5% of suspensions are for kids not being in school. Okay? So when we take a look at the rationale for why kids are not in school, more often than not, it's not for things which are really flagrant, right? These are things that we as adults can work on to see kids differently and make sure they're there. Because every educator will tell you the biggest driver for educational achievement for a child is having the child in the classroom. Okay, one other thing on this. Nationwide, an African American student is 3 times more likely to be suspended than a student that identifies white, not of Hispanic origin. In the state of Minnesota, that number is 8%, 8 times more likely. And if you identify as indigenous, nationwide, this is shameful to say even out loud, it's 5 times more likely. And in the state of Minnesota, it's 10 times more likely. Okay? So that's what the data is. So the first thing that we have to do within this is that we have to have transparency with that data and sharing information. And when we sat down as the Department of Human Rights, we really asked for the school officials to be meeting with parents and be transparent with their data, find ways in which they can intervene, and find other ways to address what they feel as inappropriate behavior within the classroom besides suspending the student. And we found that there were a lot of great interventions that kids could come up with their own self to resolve a lot of these disputes. So, transparency, parents involved, empower students to find alternatives to suspension. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into labeling kids with disability, but that's a big issue too. Hopefully we'll have a chance to have a further conversation on that.
Wait, can I just follow up?
Yeah.
Did they give any explanation for the rationale why it would make sense to suspend a child for missing school? It just seems insane.
So, I appreciate the question. So, there wasn't really any good explanation for it. And I think this is also one where you obviously know about gathering information. It's really important. And the assumption is you're gathering that information, you're tracking it. There are some schools that were good about tracking it, or at least having the superintendent trying to drive it. But there were other superintendents where, as across the table from them, they hadn't seen the data. They did not know how bad their data was. And again, this wasn't 1 year, it was 5 years worth of data.
Thanks, Kevin and Neil.
Good evening and welcome. Jason Harris. This is for Justice Page. As a former Page mentor and current high school principal, knowing that adult role models are one of the 40 developmental assets for a positive youth development, what tips and guidance would you give schools and systems looking to implement mentorship?
Thank you for the question. Let me begin by saying having children, well, let me back up. We are influenced by those we can reach out and touch. We all are. We like to talk about heroes and role models and athletes and entertainers, but we're influenced by people we can actually communicate with, see, hear, talk to. And having people come to school, adults, talk interact with children, have children be able to talk about their hopes and dreams and how they want to get there, and have those adults talk about how they fulfilled their hopes and dreams or what their current hopes and dreams are. Those experiences are invaluable. 30 plus years ago, my wife Diane and I started the Page Education Foundation. And we do two things. One, provide financial assistance to young men and women of color across Minnesota going to Minnesota schools. But secondly, and most important, we require our Page scholars, we require them to work with young children, kindergarten through 8th grade, specifically in the area of education, as tutors, mentors, and role models, so that those young children can see somebody who looks like them, who comes from their neighborhood, who has some shared experience using education as a tool. As I said, we are influenced by those we can reach out and touch. I spend a lot of time in schools and classrooms, talking with young children, sharing ideas with them, listening to what they have to say. That experience is an experience that benefits, hopefully, those young children, but it also benefits me. You know, mentorships, it's not a one-way street. Everybody learns in the process and should understand that. It's not about coming in and telling children whatever it may be. It's about sharing ideas. It's about listening to them. It's about offering them your experience and your wisdom and letting them sort out how they use that. That's when we do that, when we have those adults interacting with children, good things happen. And thank you for having been one of our Page scholars, because in reality, you have changed the future for all those children you touched and continue to touch.
Thank you, Justice Page, and thank you, Jason Harris.
My name is Janine Deming, and my question is for Neil. In Minnesota, there is a high demand for employees in the trade industry, but our education system is not preparing black kids for these opportunities and others. What can be done to change this situation?
Well, I think a few things can be done. It's funny, when you look at how people enter the trades, oftentimes it is their neighbor, their uncle, their father, their brother, somebody that they know is in the trades already. And then they say, hey, there are good jobs available over here. And then that personal network gets them into it. And so I think part of it is going to be, and I know people in the labor unions who actively want to reach out to diverse communities who they're not touching right now. So I think part of it is the unions themselves who represent the trades continuing to build relationships in the diverse communities. Part of it is the community colleges and the trade schools making sure that they are open and available to those communities of color and the employers. I mean, I don't think there's not one quick fix, but that's a great example where you hear businesses all the time saying we can't find the workers that we need, and then you also go into communities and they say, hey, we don't have the jobs that our folks, they're looking for work. And so this is definitely a win-win if we can break down some of these barriers and to get these connections in place. And the thing is, once you get a few people in, then they create a pipeline. They create a pathway for many others from their communities. And so it's getting those first few through the door that I think is so important. Thank you.
I have a question after this one.
Could I add to that?
Yep.
So as a Commissioner of Human Rights, one of the things that we had oversight was for construction on large buildings, such as a stadium, such as a state capitol, So when I was commissioner 2011, the goal for people of color was less than 10%, okay, on state projects. And in 2011 or 2012, the number of able-bodied people who identified as people of color potentially in the trade was greater than 10%. So we adjusted the goal to 32%. What Neil was talking about is that you had unions and you had officials respond to that. So in Hennepin and Ramsey County, the goal was 32%. The 5 counties around it was 22%. On US Bank Stadium project, we saw participation over 35% for people of color, and for women, it was a little over 10%. And we had never had a project, by the way, for women where we ever had more than 5% on a project in which there was more than $200 million spent by the state. Okay? So, goes back to intentionality. If you say you're going to be reaching out to these communities, you have to reach out to those communities. You have to create opportunities for people to see themselves in these spaces. So when we started talking about employment opportunities, take-home salary of $70,000 or $100,000, a lot of people didn't know that. So to your point, when you started talking about the average median income for a family of 4 that identifies as African American in the state of Minnesota is less than $29,000 a year. So having a job in the trades, right, is a huge impact to our respective community. When you're talking about housing, again, when I sat on the task force for ending homelessness, the housing rate for African Americans for the state is about 28%. Now, if you think about that house burden cost, or rent burden cost you were talking about, if half of us are only making $28,000 a year, and of those, we're spending more than 30%, we can't ever afford to get a house.
Right, exactly.
So these might not seem like taking us zooming all the way out into space, but every one of these job opportunities and creating pathways, they start to add up and they're really significant. So what the state did in that short period of time, cities, counties, colleges, other organizations can be doing the same thing. And I'm really hoping we're going to see this as an opportunity to create good paying jobs. Those change trajectories. Those change community outcomes.
That's right.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. We have one more question, and I'll ask the question. Again, I'm John Smith, and I'm from Promise Neighborhood, and our work is community and family focused. I've heard a couple statements today, and one was, how do we hold people accountable when they say that they want diversity and equity and inclusion? And our work is focused on the families and the community that we serve. And so many times we go back and forth between how do we serve the kid, or how do we serve the family, and no kid's going to survive on their own. So this question is for any of the panel members to ask, specifically, how can we make sure that these systems and these institutions include our kids, our families, and our community in the work that they're doing and hold them accountable? Any suggestions about that from any panel member?
Well, let me just begin by saying people in power are responsive to the vote. We have to vote, and when those in elected positions aren't doing what we want them to do, we have the power to change that. We have to be engaged. Nobody's going to do anything for us. I mean, if we're going to wait for somebody to do it for us, we'll be here 50 years from now still waiting, as we have the last 50 years. We have to start taking control for ourselves.
I would add, back to the amendment that Justice Page and I proposed, ultimately we have to give power to families that don't have power today. And the biggest changes in our nation's history have come through civil rights. Think about the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which abolished slavery, the 15th Amendment, which gave freed slaves the right to vote, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, Brown versus Board of Education. Sweeping changes have taken place when we use the power of civil rights to give families and individuals power. And what we're seeing today is that there are people in America, people in Minnesota, who don't have any power because they don't have an education. And if you don't have much education, then you don't get the housing that you were talking about. You don't get the job opportunity. You don't get the health care. So many things come from that. And so that's why Justice Page and I had said, let's start at the foundation of our state. And that is our state constitution. Let's enshrine a quality public education for every child as a civil right. If we're serious about making change, everybody you meet says, I'm for children first. Great. Let's enshrine it in the Constitution, and then we'll know you're serious. Enough talk.
And that point that Neil just made about the country advancing, too often we get into this, that in order for me to succeed, Neil has to lose, right? So this is an opportunity for us to break that cycle, because if you really honestly look at the country, as rights have been expanded, there's been more richness of relationship, there has been greater opportunities for more people, and there has been a greater bounty for more people. And we've got to constantly remind folks that get locked into, I'm gonna lose something just because somebody else got something. I tell you, if I was playing on a football team and Alan Page was on my team, I would be thinking we're gonna win more, right? So to that extent, when we see students in the classroom getting the education that they need, that we see communities and individuals in our communities having benefits, we should be thinking we are going to benefit from that.
And can I build on
Absolutely.
what Kevin just said? You know, knowledge, just to hammer his point home, if more people have knowledge, knowledge you can share. It's not finite. So if my children get a good education, that does not mean that your children cannot also have the same learning. And that's what's so wonderful about education. It is not a scarce resource. The more people that get the skills and that get the education, we are all better off for it. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. But you said it's not a scarce resource, but it is. Some people are afraid of losing, and if we could change the civil rights and make everything better for everyone, I think that everyone should join in. And you spoke about voter registration and people voting in years than when we couldn't vote. I just think that we're better together and that things are going to change, and I'm going to continue to do the work that I do to help in changing the system.
Can I just say one last thing? For me, at the end of the day, this is about justice, educational justice, and ensuring that every child has the opportunity for educational justice will benefit all of us. Because the reality is that educational justice is linked to housing justice. It is linked to health justice. It is linked to economic justice, to social justice, to racial justice. By opening up opportunity for all, we are all better off. And we can bend the moral arc of justice towards freedom and opportunity. We have that power.
Okay. Well, before I thank our panel and our wonderful audience, this is six in a series of events that have been hosted by the Minnesota Humanities Center and the Federal Reserve and Justice Page. So there'll be other conversations, and you should tune in to those conversations as well. I'd like to thank Kevin Lindsay, Neil Kashkari, the wonderful Janice Sims, and Justice Page for coming out today, along with our audience. And a special thanks to Pat Welter for helping Promise Neighborhood put all of this together. But thanks, and hopefully these conversations can continue.
Thank you, guys.
Great
That was-
job.
that was